Imagine being strapped down, seconds away from death, when suddenly, the unthinkable happens. What would you do if you survived the one thing no one escapes, an execution? In this video, we're diving into the unbelievable, jaw-dropping stories of convicts who somehow cheated death in the most extreme ways imaginable. From botched injections to gallows that just wouldn't work, these are the death row survival stories that defied the odds and stunned the world. Stay tuned, because what you're about to see will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice and fate. Let's start. John half-hanged. Smith. John Smith earned himself notoriety as a London housebreaker who evaded execution 3 times too many. Born to a Malta farmer in 1661, Smith served the Navy first in a merchant ship, then in a man-of-war, and was discharged after the Battle of Vigo Bay. He soon enlisted as a soldier and met the bad eggs that helped him launch his career as a housebreaker. The native of New Yorkshire was first caught in 1705. Of 4 indictments, Smith was convicted of 2 on the 5th of December and sentenced to death. As though a magician or in possession of some kind of extra life, he did not care that he was sentenced to die. He was slated to be hanged on Christmas Eve of the same year. As the day arrived, he was taken to the gallows of the Manor Estate, Tyburn, in the county of Middlesex, England. His executioner suspended him, and a plethora of people, including Smith's family and friends, waited for him to die. But Smith wouldn't die and continued to struggle. Some people began to tug at his legs to help him die quickly and shorten his suffering. They eventually turned around and held up his legs to save him, as he just wouldn't die. Smith was suspended for 15 minutes until the people demanded a reprieve. The reprieve was granted, and Smith was cut down and taken to a nearby house, where he recovered and earned himself the name that stuck with him forever: Half-Hanged Smith. He was asked what he felt during his failed execution, and he replied, saying, "I remember a great pain caused by the weight of my body. My spirits were in a great uproar, pushing upwards. When they got into my head, I saw a great blaze of glaring light that seemed to go out of my head in a flash. Then the pain went. When I was cut down, I got such pins and needles pains in my head that I could have hanged the people who set me free." He was set free on the 20th of February 1706, and you'd think he'd turn a new leaf, but he resumed housebreaking and was caught yet again. Following a series of weird events, the jury decided to leave the verdict of his second conviction to 12 judges, and these judges acquitted Smith. Smith, apparently growing smug at his evasion of justice, continued in his ways and was captured for a 3rd time. Surely there'd be no hope for John Half-Hanged Smith this time, the people thought, and he'd be executed once and for all. However, the prosecutor in his case died a day before his trial, and Smith was once again a free man. In 1727, at the age of 66, Smith, under the alias of John Wilson, was caught for the 4th time as he tried to steal a padlock. His accomplice escaped, but Smith was clearly too old to outrun the police. He was found guilty of theft, and this time around, the judge decided he would be sentenced to transportation to Virginia, United States, ending his streak of getaways. The exiled thief appealed his sentence to Sir John Isles Knight, requesting physical punishment so he could maybe survive again. The court took no pity on him, and in spite of his physical disabilities and role as a father to 2 children, he was finally transported to Virginia in July of 1727 on the convict voyage. Susanna Wenceslao Moguel. When Moguel Herrera was born on the 1st of November 1896 in Merida, Yucatan, Mexico, he was a soldier and served under the famous revolutionary Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution, which lasted between 1910 and 1920. Pancho Villa was defeated in 1915 by the Constitutionalists, who were known as the Federales, and this instantly spelled doom for all of Villa's followers. The regional de facto armies pursued Villa's loyalists, who were rather powerful in northern Mexico, and executed them on the flimsiest of allegations. On the 18th of March 1915, Moguel was one of such revolutionaries to be captured. Only 25 years old, he was branded a traitor and sentenced to death by Colonel Ortiz the same day he was captured. Ortiz sentenced him to execution by a firing squad without a trial. Death by a firing squad was the popular means of execution during the Mexican Revolution. The squad was made up of 10 soldiers, 9 of whom would line up and fire their weapons at the same time. The 10th officer was there to deliver what was known as the coup de grace or the kill shot. Moguel was positioned, and the federales took their positions, ready to send Moguel to his creator. The 9 men fired shots into Moguel's body, aiming at his vital organs, and the 10th officer delivered the kill shot to his head at point-blank range to ensure he was dead, leaving him there to rot. Moguel survived 10 devastating shots and played dead despite the excruciating pain so that the federales would assume he was dead. He then crawled 3 blocks away from the scene and went to the Church of St. James Apostle, where he was found and taken care of until he recovered. Some sources claim that he was found lying unconscious among the dead bodies of his comrades and nursed back to health afterward. Whatever the tale, Moguel survived death by a firing squad and was rightly dubbed El Fusilado, meaning the shot one. He was disfigured for life from this incident, but he lived a normal life after his recovery. He even appeared on the radio show of Robert L. Ripley, called Ripley's Believe It or Not, on July 16, 1937, at Cleveland, Ohio. He was also made the subject of a song titled El Fusilado by the British anarchist band Chumbawamba. He lived his life to the fullest and died on the 29th of July, 1976, at the age of 79. William Duell. The story of William Duell sounds like nothing less than an old English tale about yet again surviving the gallows. Duell was born in 1723, and when only 17 years old, he was convicted of being an accessory to the rape of Sarah Griffin in Acton, London, in September 1740. Sarah Griffin embarked on a journey back home to rural Worcestershire from London due to her declining health. On her way, she met Duell, who was a farmer's lad at a barn in Acton. Duell offered to give Griffin a place to stay for the night, and she agreed. After Griffin retired to her bed of hay, Duell went out and boasted to 5 men about knowing the whereabouts of a young woman travelling alone. The 5 men attacked Sarah and launched a series of attacks that can only be described as heinous. According to Press Reader, Sarah tried to defend herself by crying out that she was poxed, but the attackers paid zero heed to this information. She was assaulted multiple times, beaten terribly, and even robbed. Sarah died the next day, whilst undergoing treatment by a local surgeon. Young Duell was blamed as the main culprit because he was the one who had let the other men know about Sarah's whereabouts. The judge overlooked the fact that Duell was a minor and sentenced him to death by hanging. The court recorder noted that Duell, with tears in his eyes, acknowledged himself guilty of rape, robbery, and murder. On November 24, 1740, he was hanged in Tavern along with 4 others. Duell reportedly hung for 20 minutes before his body was cut down. He was then taken to the Anatomy Theatre at the Worshipful Company of Barbers and Surgeons to be dissected for medical study purposes. He was stripped and laid on a board, ready to be anatomized, until one of the servants noticed that he had begun breathing slowly. His breath soon picked up and became faster. He was then bled, and shortly after could sit upright without any support. Duell was taken back to prison that night, and upon questioning, stated that he didn't even remember being hanged. He suffered from fever and delirium during his trial and execution, and people suggested that this terrible state ultimately saved his life. He was back to normal the next day, as though he hadn't just cheated death at the gallows. The public soon heard about his survival, and there was widespread excitement about dead-alive Duell. His sentence was eventually changed, and he was exiled to Boston, Massachusetts, America, where he lived and died in his 80s. Alireza M., a 37-year-old man in his right senses identified simply as Alireza M., was caught smuggling crystal meth into Iran in 2013, the same year Amnesty International claimed that Iranian authorities executed 508 people, with the majority connected to drug offences. Needless to say, it didn't take a long debate for a revolutionary court to find Alireza guilty and sentence him to death. On the cool autumn morning of Wednesday, October 9th of the same year, Alireza was transported from his cell in Bosnad prison, located in Iran's northern Khorasan province, to be hanged before the sun greeted the earth. On that day, Alireza was hanged and left to die. After being suspended for 12 minutes, he was certified dead, cut down, and sent to the morgue for his family to claim his body. The next morning, a worker was preparing his supposedly lifeless body for collection by his family and discovered that there was some kind of condensation in the plastic cover used to wrap his body. This indicated that Alireza was still alive and, in fact, breathing. He was rushed instantly to Bosnod's Imam Ali Hospital, where medics began treatment to restore him back to health. Authorities brought this to the attention of the judge that condemned Alireza for possessing a kilo of crystal meth, and the judge determined that he was to be put to death again once medical staff confirmed his health condition was good enough. In Iran, convicts should be conscious and relatively healthy before execution. Hanging is delayed for people who are pregnant or in a coma. The Iranian government soon received heat for this decision, but they stood their ground, stating that Alireza was sentenced to death and not to hang, and since he was still alive, the sentence had not been fulfilled. Mohammad Irfan, a judge with Iran's Administrative Justice Court, told Jam Jam, "The sentence issued by the Revolutionary Court is the death penalty. In such circumstances, it should be repeated." Once again, the case garnered international attention, and various human rights groups called against the re-execution of Alireza. Amnesty International's Philip Luther said the move to hang him again betrayed a basic lack of humanity. According to CNN, Alireza survived hanging and then survived a judicial review. Iran's Justice Minister, Mustafa Pourmohammadi, told the nation's official news agency, IRNA, that the convict would not be executed again. Alireza not only survived the ropes, but was granted a reprieve at a time when Iran's laws against drugs were considered the strictest. Zulaika Kadkota. On the 11th of August 1997, Zulaika Kadkota, an Iranian national, was arrested and charged with engaging in extramarital sexual relations. She was immediately condemned to death by the decree of the religious magistrate at the time, Hakim Shah, and fully supported by the Friday prayer leader of Ali Abad village, Khalifa Day. In cases of adultery, when a person is sentenced to death, the preferred method of execution is death by stoning. The individual is buried in a hole, a man to his waist and a woman sometimes to her chest. They are then pelted with rocks until they no longer breathe. Kadkota was taken on that same day to a field and was buried from her waist down in a ditch by civilian supporters of the Islamic regime in conjunction with the local Pasdaran and Basijis. They began stoning Kadkota mercilessly until outraged villagers rallied and stopped them from attacking the half-buried woman. She received severe injuries to her head and face. The villagers immediately dug her out and rushed her to the nearby Buchan hospital. News of the pelting spread quickly and was met with great shock and disapproval among the people of the city and the villagers of Buchan. The local authorities bent to pressure and promised to grant Kadkota amnesty if she survived. Or so the people thought. Rumours had it that they, in fact, still had plans to stone her a second time. Various human rights bodies weighed in heavily on the matter. In one letter captioned "Action Request by the World Organization Against Torture, OMCT, the body requested that Kadkota be granted total amnesty following her full recovery. It is also important to note that, under Iranian law, when someone is sentenced to death by stoning in cases like adultery, if they by any means climb out of the ground after being buried up to the neck, or by a stroke of chance survive the ordeal, their life is spared. In a document released by Amnesty International on May 14, 1998, the Iranian authority stated that the death sentence against Zulaika Kadkota had been lifted and that she was released on the 26th of November, 1997. This brought the reign of terror on Kadkota's life to an end and paved the way for her name to enter the books of those that cheated the death penalty. Anne Green. Anne Green was a domestic servant who was accused of committing infanticide in 1650. If you haven't already guessed it, Green survived the English gallows too. Green was born sometime in 1628 in the cosy town of Steeple Barton, Oxfordshire. When she became an adult, she began working as a scullery maid at the house of a man named Sir Thomas Reed. Being a scullery maid meant Green only worked as an assistant to other maids and remained one of the lowest ranked in Thomas's household. Woes began for 22-year-old Green when she became pregnant for Sir Thomas's teen grandson, Geoffrey Reed. Green claimed that she was seduced by Geoffrey and that she had no knowledge of the pregnancy until she had a miscarriage in her 17th week. She tried to hide the remains of the underdeveloped fetus, but she was caught and accused of infanticide. Her boss pressed charges and insisted that she was guilty under Acts 1624 of English law, which held a legal presumption that a woman who concealed the death of her illegitimate child had murdered it. Despite testimonies from an experienced midwife and from Green's co-workers that she did not intentionally kill the child, Green was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. She requested that a few of her friends be present at her execution to pull her swinging legs, perhaps to hasten the death. On the 14th of December 1650, Green was hanged at Oxford Castle, and while her friends tugged at her legs, a soldier struck her at least 4 times with the bottom of his musket to hasten her death. After hanging for 30 minutes, everyone present concluded that Green was dead, and so she was cut down and sent to physicians at the University of Oxford to be anatomized. The 2 physicians, William Petty and Thomas Willis, upon examining Green, discovered that she had a faint pulse and was breathing weakly. They immediately alerted their other colleagues, who joined in to try to save Green. The group of 4 physicians tried many remedies, including a tobacco smoke enema. Green was then laid next to another warm body to keep her warm. She quickly regained her health and even started to speak. After 12 to 14 hours, Green was not only alive but 100% well, save for memory loss about the time surrounding her execution. Sir Thomas Reed passed 3 days after Green's execution, and so, when she was granted a reprieve, there was no prosecutor to object to the decision. The authorities believed that the hand of God had saved her to prove her innocence, and so granted her a pardon. Anne Green took her coffin with her as a keepsake when she left to stay with friends in the country. She eventually got married, had 3 children, and died in 1659. Willie Francis. Young Willie Francis experienced the infamous gruesome Gertie, Louisiana's notorious electric chair, twice. Surviving the horrific experience once, he succumbed on the 2nd attempt. Francis, who became known as the black teenager who was executed twice, was only 17 when he was arrested. He was arrested in Texas City on suspicion of peddling drugs with another drug dealer simply because he was carrying a briefcase and speaking with a stutter. Francis was only visiting his sister in Port Arthur, but the police detained him anyway. They were unable to connect him to the dealer and soon began to grill him about the murder of Cajun pharmacist Andrew Thomas. Thomas had been shot and killed 16 months earlier in St. Martinville, Louisiana. Sources claimed that Sheriff E.L. Rez Weber had called upon the chief of police in Port Arthur to arrest any man so they could close the case. Young Francis, who was 15 at the time, was the unlucky scapegoat. Within minutes of his arrest, there was already a signed confession by Francis claiming he had killed Thomas in November of 1944. The next day, a second confession was released. He was immediately charged to court, and in 3 weeks, Francis was standing in the presence of a grand jury of 12 white men. He pleaded not guilty to the charges, but the police alleged that Francis was found carrying the dead man's wallet at the time of his arrest. However, no evidence of this was presented in court. The murder weapon was linked to Deputy Sheriff August Fusilier, who had, in fact, threatened to kill Andrew Thomas. However, they claimed Francis had stolen the gun. Despite the flimsy case presented by the prosecution, Francis's appointed defense attorneys did absolutely nothing to defend him. As a result, he was quickly found guilty and sentenced to death by the electric chair. On May 3, 1946, Francis was driven almost 10 miles past his childhood home from his courthouse jail cell to be electrocuted. He was strapped into gruesome Gertie, and the switch was flicked. Unknown to everyone present, the portable electric chair had been set up incorrectly by a drunk prison guard and his assistant, who was an inmate. Witnesses reported hearing Francis screaming at the executioners, "Take it off, let me breathe," from underneath the leather hood. He survived the execution as the surge of current was not enough to kill him, though it left him bald. Francis's father then sought the services of defense attorney Bertrand de Blanc, who fought to prevent a re-execution. De Blanc, who had been best friends with the late Thomas, took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. Even though the re-execution was prohibited by the Constitution, the Supreme Court rejected his appeal. De Blanc then commenced proceedings to have Francis' conviction overturned. However, the discouraged teenager, now 18, had lost all hope and persuaded his attorney to quit just days before his scheduled second execution. On May 9, 1947, a little over a year after his botched execution, Willie Francis sat in the electric chair again. Willie, who had told reporter Elliot Chase a few days prior that he was going to meet the Lord with his Sunday pants and Sunday heart, was pronounced dead at 10 minutes past noon. Doyle Hamm. Doyle Hamm was an American criminal sentenced to death in 1987 for the murder of Patrick Cunningham, a man he killed during a robbery. Hamm was born the 10th of 12 children in February 1957 into a family of crime. Hamm's father and his 6 elder brothers had all spent time in jail. One of Hamm's sisters stated that their father always told them that if they didn't go out to steal, then they were not Hamms. So no surprise that by the time Doyle Hamm was an adult, he had several run-ins with the law for burglary, assault, and grand larceny. He met his downfall after going on a crime spree on January 24, 1987, which ended in the murder of Patrick Cunningham at a motel in Cullman, Alabama. Cunningham, a nighttime clerk at the motel, died from a single gunshot wound to the temple, fired from a pistol Hamm had stolen in Mississippi during his spree. That day, Hamm stole $350 from the motel's cash register and $60 from Cunningham's wallet before fleeing the scene. He was detained the following day in Cullman and charged with capital murder, making him instantly eligible for the death penalty. The trial was a roller coaster ride. His defense attorneys failed to properly lay out his defense, despite knowing that Hamm suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome and had an IQ of 66. By 1999, another hearing was held to review his claims that his defense attorney did a terrible job during the first trial 12 years earlier. Hamm was diagnosed with lymphatic and cranial cancer in early 2014 while still on death row. Amidst his ongoing court cases, he underwent strenuous treatment. Despite his condition, the Alabama Supreme Court set his execution date for Thursday, February 22, 2018. Chief Judge Boudry ordered an independent medical examination of Hamm to determine if he was in a condition to receive lethal injection. The medical examination found that Hamm's arms and hands were unusable, but his lower extremities were deemed usable. Several bodies, including his defense attorneys, argued that the attempt would only cause the terminally ill man injuries. Nevertheless, the state of Alabama proceeded. During the execution, correctional officers spent 2.5 hours poking Hamm's legs and ankles with needles, trying to find a vein. The execution team even turned him on his stomach and slapped the back of his legs in an attempt to find a usable vein. When they couldn't find any, the executioners resorted to callously inserting needles into Hamm's groin in a desperate attempt to locate a vein. Hamm was stabbed so many times that his bladder and femoral artery were punctured, causing him to bleed enough to soak the gurney on which he lay. The execution was eventually called off, and Hamm became the 4th person in American history since 1946 to walk out of the execution chamber alive. Even though he buckled from his injuries as soon as he got up, Hamm and the state of Alabama later reached an agreement that ensured he would no longer be executed. Hamm died from cancer-related complications while in prison at the age of 64. Ramel Broom. Rommel Broom lived a life riddled with crime. He spent his years committing first non-violent crimes and later dangerous crimes, including robbery in 1975. Her raped a 12-year-old girl who was babysitting his niece, and just 2 months later committed an armed robbery. He was arrested and charged for rape, aggravated robbery, and robbery. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. Broom was released on parole on the 11th of May 1984. Broom tried to kidnap 12-year-old Vanita McKenney on September 18, 1984, but was stopped by two neighbours before running away. Broom then kidnapped and killed 14-year-old Trina Middleton 2 days later on September 21, 1984, as she was returning home from a football game in East Cleveland, Ohio, with two of her friends. In December of the same year, Broom attempted to kidnap 11-year-old Melinda Grissom, physically assaulting her in the process. Grissom's mother held onto his car and screamed at the top of her lungs for help. Thanks to the icy road, Broom could not speed away, and Grissom's mother held on. The terrified young girl was able to escape, and two men wrote down the license plate number of Broom's car. Broom was arrested later that day and charged with his horrific crimes, including the aggravated murder of 14-year-old Middleton. He offered to plead guilty for a sentence of 30 years to life, but his offer was rejected. He was instead found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection. On September 15, 2009, Rommel Broom was laid out on a gurney, and his executioners began the process of administering the lethal drugs into his veins. They tried for 2 hours to find venous entry on his person, but were unsuccessful. This attempt was called off, and he was granted a 1-week reprieve. Broom has been punctured 18 different times. During this attempt, the state's authority to try to carry out his execution a second time was subsequently disputed by Broom, who said that doing so would violate the Constitution's prohibition on endangering someone's life twice in a 4-3 decision. On March 16, 2016, the Ohio Supreme Court dismissed his appeals and authorized the state to attempt his execution. His subsequent execution was initially scheduled for June 17, 2020, but was then moved to March 16, 2022. The battle of shoulds and shoulds came to an end on the 28th of December 2020, as Rommel Broom died from suspected COVID-19 complications at Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, age 64. John Babacom Lee. John Henry George Lee was a Victorian-era Englishman who became known as the man that could not be hanged after surviving 3 mysterious attempts at the gallows. Lee, a notorious thief, was born in Abbotsford, Devon. He served in the Royal Navy before becoming a footman and gardener for Emma Keyes at her residence, the Glen, in Babacom Bay. On Saturday, November 15, 1884, Keyes was found brutally murdered. Her skull was fractured, her throat slashed, and the attacker had set various parts of her house on fire. Lee was arrested based on circumstantial evidence. People believed he either committed the crime, helped cover it up, or was the arsonist. The prosecutors accused Lee of killing his employer because she had reduced his already poor wages. Like many during this time, Lee received inadequate legal representation. Despite his lies, Lee consistently maintained his innocence. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. During sentencing, Justice Manistee, the presiding judge, noted Lee's calm demeanour. Lee replied, "Please, my lord, allow me to say that I am so calm because I trust in my lord, and he knows that I am innocent." Lee's execution was scheduled for February 23, 1885. On that fateful day, Lee reportedly told his warders that he had dreamed the executioner would try but fail to hang him due to a broken scaffold. As the mask was placed over his face, Lee remained calm and looked toward the sky. The lever was pulled, but it refused to work. The executioner tried again, this time with 2 prison warders helping him by stamping on the platform. Still, the lever wouldn't work. Lee was removed from the platform, and the gallows were tested. Everything functioned properly. They returned Lee to the platform and tried again. The apparatus failed a second time. After removing him once more and testing the setup, they found no issue. On the third attempt, the boards creaked, but remained jammed in place. Lee was eventually escorted back to his cell, and news of his survival spread like wildfire. The Home Secretary overturned Lee's death sentence, instead condemning him to life in prison. Many believed that the gallows' repeated failures meant that Lee may have been innocent after all. In 1907, Lee was released after serving 22 years. He married, had 2 children, and spent the rest of his life exhibiting himself to earn money. Mysterious or not, surviving execution would have been nothing more than a myth if individuals like John Lee had not somehow defied death. And there you have it, stories that prove sometimes even death has a mind of its own. Convicts facing their final moments, only to walk away from the brink of execution. But the question remains, was it luck, fate, or something much darker? If you found these tales as chilling and unbelievable as we did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we've got even more shocking stories coming your way. What do you think? Did these prisoners truly defy death, or was it a simple twist of fate? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and until next time, stay curious and stay safe.